So we have Dr. Caroline Lucensmere from the US, Art O'Leary from Ireland, Ben Earsels from Belgium, Dr. Damir Kapidzik from the US, and Professor Calypso Nicolaidis from Italy. I shall now switch to Hebrew for a short introduction. Only for this part we shall have translation on the chat. Translation to English. אוקיי, דמוקרטיה 3.0 זו יוזמה שהוקמה לפני 3 שנים של מתנדבים ואנשי מקצוע מתחומים שונים כדי לקדם דמוקרטיה דליברטיבית ושיטות לשיתוף אזרחים מן השורה בעיצוב של מדיניות ציבורית. מה שמנחה את הגישה הזאת זה דגש על אזרחים מן השורה רגילים, בניגוד לבעלי עניין לצורך העניין. זה דגש על ייצוג מדויק של משתתפים על ידי מדגם סטטיסטי, מה שנקרא sortition בשפה המקצועית של התחום הזה. דגש על תרבות ופרקטיקה של דיון, אנחנו באים כדי לדון, והכל במטרה להשפיע על המדיניות הציבורית. אפשר אולי לחשוב שאספות אזרחים הן טובות לזמנים רגילים, במדינות מתוקנות, שלבות, אבל ככל שאנחנו שוקדים על המשימה של יישום אספות אזרחים בישראל, דווקא בזמן המורכב הזה, אנחנו לומדים שיש ניסיון לא מועט בעולם, שמראה שאספות אזרחים הם כלי מועיל ומקדם פתרונות בשעות משבר. המטרה של הוובינר הזה זה לשתף אתכם בתהליך המחקר שאנחנו עשינו על השאלות האלה. כמובן שהתשובה לשאלות האלה היא כן, אפשר ואולי כדאי לעשות אספות אזרחים גם בזמן משבר. אנחנו נרצה להתרכז ב4 מקרים של אספות אזרחים מסוגים שונים. אנחנו נספר על ההקשר בו הן פעלו, על התוצאות והאימפקט שלהם, וכולם התמודדו עם משבר וקונפליקט מסוגים שונים. אני כן אגיד שבמפגש הזה אנחנו לא רוצים להתרכז ממש באיך עושים אספת אזרחים, כי יש כבר הרבה ידע על זה, גם בעולם וגם בארץ, בין היתר אצלנו. גם באתר שלנו אתם יכולים למצוא חומרים רבים, גם בעקבות הניסיון שלנו בשנה שעברה בביצוע של אספת אזרחים ברשות מקומית. בגדול אני רוצה, כדי לספר בכל זאת על התהליך, לשתף בשקף אחד שמראה את התהליך הזה של איך אספת אזרחים עובדת, כן? יש מישהו רשות שלטונית שממנה אספה, ממשלה, רשות מקומית, אם מדובר, זה יכול להיות גם ברמה בינלאומית, נגיד האיחוד האירופאי, שממנה את האספה ונותנת את המנדט לאספה גם, כן? השלב השני הוא שלב של מדגם מייצג, הסורטישן שהזכרתי מקודם, בחירה של מדגם מייצג של אזרחים, לפי חתכים מגוונים כדי לייצג את האוכלוסייה כולה. זה אומר שכל אזרח יכול למצוא את עצמו בתוך האספה. יש תהליך של למידה, לומדים את הסוגיה שעל הפרק. יש תהליך של דיון, כי אמרנו שדיון נמצא במרכז. ויש תהליך של גיבוש של המלצות, כי המטרה של האספה היא לייצר המלצות למי שמינה את האספה הזאת. ההמלצות מוגשות, ואספות שונות נבדלות במידת המנדט ובכוח שיש להמלצות האלה, כן? אבל בדרך כלל מי שעושה תהליכים כאלה הוא מתכוון להיות מושפע מההמלצות האלה. אז כך מתנהלות אספות, אנחנו נראה פה מקרים שונים של אספות. בדרך כלל באספה יש 100-150 אנשים במדגם מייצג, אבל המקרה של בלגיה אנחנו נראה אספה של 1,000 אנשים, ובמקרה של ניו אורלינס אנחנו נראה אספה של קרוב ל4,000 אנשים. אז זה בגדול על התהליך. אחד מהמקומות, אני חוזר לישראל, אליו מתנקז המאמץ עכשיו להשתקם ולקום מהמשבר הנוכחי שלנו, בשיתוף התושבים, הוא מנהלת תקומה בעוטף עזה. זו הסיבה שאנחנו שמחים וגם ביקשנו משחר שרפ, שהיא מנהלת שיתוף ציבור ושקיפות במידע במנהלת תקומה, לומר דברי פתיחה. So I invite Shachar Sharp, Manager for Public Participation and Information Transparency at the Restoration Authority, to say a few words for opening words. Yeah, Shachar.
היי, תודה רונן ותודה לחברים של על הקיום של הוובינר הזה. זו למידה חשובה בטח בהקשר ובנקודת הזמן שאנחנו נמצאים בה. אני אגיד מילה אולי על תקומה שקמה ממש שבועיים אחרי 7 באוקטובר כתוצאה מהחלטת ממשלה, ושמה לה כעיקרון מנחה ששיקום העוטף לא יתקיים בלי שיתוף התושבים, התושבות, רשויות המקומיות, ובעבודה רב מגזרית. זה בא לידי ביטוי ממש בכל תהליכי העבודה, בתהליך גיבוש תוכנית החומש שאנחנו נמצאים בו בימים אלו, בהקצאת תפקיד ייעודי, שזה התפקיד שאני עושה היום, ובאמת בלמידה של כלים חדשניים, כמו ועידת אזרחים וכלים מקוונים ואחרים, כדי באמת להגיע לקהל תושבים שהוא לא בהכרח תמיד משתתף ולוקח חלק בתהליכים האלה, זאת אומרת לא להגיע תושבים רק באמצעות ההנהגות שלהם, ממש לנסות ולהגיע לקהל ולהסכמות רחבות ככל הניתן. אנחנו עובדים גם ברמת הרשות וגם מקדמים תפיסה אזורית, ובכל הרמות האלה אנחנו רוצים לא להביא רק לשיקום ההריסות, אלא להביא לפריחה ולשגשוג של החבל, וזאת על ידי באמת רתימה של התושבים ועבודה רב מגזרית, להכניס עמותות, להכניס מגזר עסקי, להסתכל על הבעיה הזאת כבעיה מאוד רחבה שהפתרון לה לא נמצא במקום אחד והתשובות שלה לא נמצאות במקום אחד. אז בהקשר הזה עוד פעם מברכת את המפגש פה היום, וגם מזמינה את כל המשתתפים פה שבוודאי הנושא קרוב לליבם. יש לכם גם רעיונות וגם תפיסות וגם הצעות לאופן שבו ניתן לקדם שיתוף ציבור באמצעות העבודה של תקומה, אז מוזמנים לפנות אליי. אני אשמח כמובן לשמוע ולהיות בקשר עם כל מי שהנושא קרוב לליבו. אז שוב תודה רונן.
תודה שחר. Thank you שחר for these opening words. אני רוצה להזכיר שיש לנו צ'אט, ואתם מוזמנים מאוד להעלות שם תגובות וגם שאלות. אנחנו לא מבטיחים שאנחנו נוכל להתייחס להכל, אנחנו רוצים לעשות את זה, זה תלוי בלוח הזמנים שיהיה. אנחנו נסיים בכל מקרה בשעה 5:30. בכל מקרה נשמח להערות ולתגובות שלכם, זה בטח יעשיר את המפגש הזה. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Art O'Leary from Ireland. Art O'Leary is the Chief Executive at Ireland's Electoral Commission, responsible for managing electoral and democratic matters. He organized Ireland's first Citizen Assembly in 2012, leading to several key constitutional referendums, including marriage equality, and has been instrumental in Irish democracy, serving as secretary to 2 national citizen assemblies on biodiversity loss. From 2014 to 2021, he was the Secretary General to Irish President Michael Higgins, acting as Chief of Staff and Advisor. His background includes over 20 years in the Irish Parliament, managing various parliamentary functions. Art will present the case of Citizen Assembly in Ireland 2012, starting at 2012, as a reaction to a social and economical crisis starting in 2009. So the floor is yours, Art. May I say and remind all that we have 12 minutes for each presentation.
Thank you, Ronan. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak with you today. And I'll get straight to it because I've got 12 minutes and this is a story that I could tell over many, many days. So I'll crack on. About 12 years ago, I got a phone call at 11 o'clock at night, and my heart sank, because I don't know about you, but nobody rings me at 11 o'clock at night to say they're having a good day. I was working in the Parliament at the time as a civil servant, and I assumed I was responsible for the communications function. So I assumed it was a newspaper editor with a story that was going to ruin my week. But it was my Prime Minister. And he said, Art, I have a job for you. And I said, well, this will be a short conversation, Prime Minister, because I already have a job. Thank you very much. And he said, no, I mean, this government had just been elected on the basis of transformation following a very traumatic financial crisis. And he said, we were elected on the basis of transformation, doing things differently. We are a government that are going to listen to the people, and we're going to do things differently. And we have something in our program for government called a Citizens Assembly. It's never, ever going to work, but it's in our program for government, and we have to do it. We're a government that keeps our promises. And I said, well, I don't know anything about it, but tell me about it. And he said, we're going to put 100 people in a room, randomly selected, and we're going to ask them a whole series of very difficult questions, and they're going to make recommendations, and we're going to see what we can do about it. And I said, well, Prime Minister, that sounds exactly right. That's not going to work. Your instinct on this is correct. But he said, yes, I know, but we have to do it anyway. In the 12 years since, I have discovered that there is a hunger across the world for citizens to become involved in policy development and in decision making. It astonishes me that 12 years later, I'm still talking about it, and perhaps even still doing it, because I ran a couple of citizens' assemblies in my spare time last year. I've spoken in 41 countries in the last 18 months for politicians and for citizens who want to become involved in the way decisions are made in their country. And I can say, without fear of contradiction, that citizens' assemblies in Ireland have transformed our society. They have changed the way that we approach decision making and policy development, for one main reason, is that it provides a safe and respectful environment in which we can have a discussion about intractable political conversations, and problems, and this has been difficult. I mean, for the last 40 to 50 years, it was impossible for us as a nation, as a society, to have a conversation around abortion and marriage equality, and some of the difficult conversations that we had to have around climate change. We put these issues into a citizens' assembly, allowed them make recommendations, and this process, this platform, have led to serious constitutional change in our country and has changed the laws in dozens of different cases. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about a couple of things. One is that if you go down this road, there will be a number of criticisms of the process. And secondly, I'm going to give you some thoughts on some simple ingredients for success. So firstly, the criticisms, let's deal with these quickly. The first criticism will be, we don't need a citizens' assembly. We already have one. It's called a parliament. And this is exactly true. And citizens' assemblies are no threat to our parliamentary democracy. They help, they support and enrich and enhance the policy development process. Because for the last 100 years in our country, we have developed policy using three methods. We elect governments with a manifesto who's promised, here's all the things we'll do when we get into government. We've got civil servants, people like me, grey suit and a comb over, whose job is to give advice on issues, and we engage with stakeholders, people with skin in the game, people with an interest in it. All we're doing with Citizens Assembly is to add another leg to this three-legged stool, to say that we're now asking citizens for their view on these particular issues. The second criticism is that, well, this is just a big focus group. And there is one big difference between a focus group and a citizens' assembly. And with a focus group, you put a representative group of people into a room and you ask them their opinion. So what do you think of such and such a political party? Who does your life insurance? What should the government do about biodiversity loss or abortion or marriage equality? And at the end of that process, the polling company prints the opinion and say, here's the news, here's what the Irish people think. With a Citizens Assembly, we put a representative group of people into a room and we fill them with information. We make them experts in the subject on which they're being asked to consider. And at the end of that process, then we ask them, well, what do you think we should do about biodiversity loss or abortion or marriage equality or climate change? And it is an informed opinion, which is a huge difference between that and a focus group. The four big ingredients for success, to my mind, are very, very straightforward. First of all is leadership. Our Prime Minister led from the front here, and he said, this is a priority for me and for my government. And when that's the case, then the rest of the civil service, the rest of the system, the civil service system and the political system, they tend to fall into line. So if something is a priority for the Prime Minister, it's a priority for everybody. That leadership was absolutely critical. The second one is the representativeness of the room. We have 100 people in our Citizens Assembly who are representative of the Irish people. We call it Ireland in one room. So some of this is very easy. You know, we've got 51 women and 49 men. We've got 12 people between the age of 18 and 24. We've got 28 people who live in Dublin, our capital city. So some of that age, region and gender is very straightforward. We also have 4 farmers in the room, because 4% of our population are farmers. We've 11 people with a disability. We've 18 people who weren't born in our country. And you get the picture. It goes on and on. We build up layers and layers of randomly selected individuals in order to be able to complete the picture of Ireland in one room. And most of the citizens in our country, they should be able to see themselves in that room. And if they don't see themselves exactly, they should be able to see their opinion represented. And we have the greatest example of this is in our abortion Citizens Assembly. Our citizens voted by 67 to 33 in favour of quite a liberal abortion regime, which shocked the media and which shocked the political system. And they said, oh, no, the Irish people will never go for that. But when the issue was put to a referendum of the Irish people, the result was 66-34. Almost an exact match to the recommendations of the Citizens Assembly. So that proves 2 things. One is that room was perfectly representative of the Irish people. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is that the Irish people were much more nuanced and advanced in their thinking on the issue of abortion than the political system gave them credit for. And this is something to bear in mind, that if you have a group of informed citizens and individuals who are willing to engage and look at an issue from many, many perspectives, you can trust citizens to do the right thing. The third point is that not every issue is suitable for a Citizens Assembly. You can imagine that in our situation when the political system discovered, whoa, we have the solution to every political difficulty that we have, because we were able to manage to solve abortion and marriage equality. Not every issue is suitable. It should be a big, meaty issue with lots of possible solutions to it. So, for instance, in the current climate, where energy is a source of debate, could a Citizens Assembly look at using nuclear energy as part of as an energy source? Perhaps, yes, it might be a good issue. Would you ask a Citizens Assembly to design you a nuclear power station? Probably not. There are some things which should be left to experts, but big, meaty policy issues can be entrusted to individuals. The final issue I would say is that citizens should be, and everybody should be aware of what happens to the outcome. We ask a Citizens Assembly to look at an issue for the guts of a year, 6 weekends normally during the course of a year, and then at the end of that process in Ireland, we send the report of the recommendations to the Parliament, where they create a committee to examine the recommendations, and then both of those reports are sent to government. The government come into the Parliament and explain which recommendations they're going to accept and when they're going to be implemented. And they also, more importantly, explain which recommendations they accept, they don't accept, and why they're not accepting them. You know, and this is critically important. Many of the citizens' assemblies which fail around the world have been because there were very unrealistic expectations in relation to what would happen with the outcome. So the citizens know from the outset that some of the recommendations may not be accepted by government, but this is the way it should be. The people of Ireland elect the government to make hard decisions. The government have to make decisions in that regard. And that's the way that the system works. It puts a little bit of pressure on our citizens to come up with reasonable, evidence-based, scientific and practical solutions, and politically acceptable solutions as well, which adds to the seriousness of the process. I know there were a number of questions which I saw flashing in the chat there. I didn't catch to get, but my time is up, and I look forward to dealing with your questions at the end of the process. Thanks, Ronan. I think for the first time in my life, I'm on time. That's not bad for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Art. May I say too that for all of us in countries advancing deliberative democracy, Irish is a model, and it's a privilege to have one of the leaders of these processes right here in our webinar. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Ronan. Thank you.
So, our next speaker is Ben Eersels from Belgium. Ben Eersels is the Executive Director of G1000, the Belgian platform for democratic innovation. G1000 has been working on citizens' assemblies for over 13 years and has designed the world's first permanent citizens dialogue in East Belgium and the permanent citizen assembly on climate in Brussels. Ben will present the case of G1000 in Belgium, which is a kind of citizen assembly, as a reaction to a governance and political crisis in 2011. Among other aspects, it's a bottom-up process that was initiated and organized by civic society. May I add, Ben, that we would like to hear a few words about the crisis too, that began all of that. So, please.
With pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for letting me share our origin story, actually, because this is also the origin story of the G1000 as an organization. Can everyone see my slides now? That's my first question.
Yes, we see.
Fantastic. So first of all, you described this quite nicely already. G1000 is right now the Belgian platform for democratic innovation. So we are a not-for-profit association that develops and supports new forms of citizen participation, and particularly citizens' assemblies. And we do that now at all levels of government, often collaborating with folks like Art, but then their Belgian equivalents. However, in 2010, this is not how we began. We started as a citizen initiative. So I'll take you back now to the roots of our own organization and the roots of what we've been doing in Belgium. But first of all, welcome to Belgium. I don't know how much you know about our country, but I think in short, we can say that we like to make things a little bit complicated sometimes. And I think for some of the Israeli people, to some extent, they will feel a bit of overlap within their own organization. Belgium consists of a northern part, the part in yellow, which is Flanders, where they speak Dutch. It's a bit richer. The southern part, which is Wallonia, where they speak French. Brussels, the tiny dot in the middle, which is the capital region. It's a region in itself where they speak, well, 2 languages, but actually a lot of different languages because it's a very diverse place. And there's a little blue part in the east, which is the German-speaking part of Belgium. So yes, we have 4 language communities, 6 governments as well. Keep this in mind for the rest of the presentation. And I'd like to describe ourselves as a country of fries, chocolate, beer, but since a few years also of democratic innovation. So the G1000.
Sorry, Ben. Can
Yeah.
you just, is there any way you can just enlarge your presentation so you can see the whole, so you don't see the slides on the left-hand side? Yeah. Perfect, thanks.
Oh, okay, I thought that was already the case. Thanks for interrupting me. So we're off again. The G1000 was a bottom-up initiative to innovate democracy in 2011. And I promised you a bit of story about the crisis as well. Well, it all started actually with the elections in 2010. This was the start of a huge political deadlock. You can see it on the map on the left side. The northern part voted nationalist right. The southern part voted left-wing or rather liberal. Brussels did the same. And this made it very difficult to come up with a government because the country still needed a federal government as well. And because the voting behavior was so different, this was very difficult to get there. We broke the world record of the longest period without a government that a country has ever had, 541 days. We smashed the former record of Cambodia, which has had about 350 days. So during this period, there was a lot of talk on, well, there is a crisis in Belgium, that's for sure. And the narrative was partially, well, maybe Belgium does not work anymore. Maybe we are just too diverse. The northern people think different than the southern people. The German-speaking people are still a bit different. Maybe Belgium just does not work anymore. But increasingly, around January 2011, there was a small group of citizens that thought, well, maybe it's not Belgium that doesn't work anymore per se, but maybe it's just politics that doesn't work anymore. And maybe it's the problem that the political parties are struggling too much because they are being too occupied with their own party programs and their own followers. And it's their problem that they don't arrive at making a governmental agreement. So the idea was then, if politicians get stuck, let citizens then show the way. And that small group of citizens had the ambition to organize a huge citizens assembly with about 1,000 randomly selected Belgian citizens. Important, we framed this, even though it was a bottom-up initiative, not as an initiative against politicians, but very much like Art said, as an initiative to strengthen representative democracy. Very short about the process. First, there was a period of agenda setting. All citizens could pick the topic that they would like to be treated in this assembly. We had 3 topics in the end: social security, welfare in times of crisis, and immigration. Juicy topics, as Art described it also. And on the 11th of November, then there was the big citizen summit, the G1000. I think to date, it's still one of the biggest citizens assemblies that was organized in Europe throughout the entire history of citizens assemblies. About 800 people in the end participated. That citizens assembly was a one-day thing. Citizens were randomly selected through a classical citizens assembly recruitment procedure. And it was followed 1 year later by a bit more of in-depth work where 32 participants from that first big citizens summit were asked again to go a bit more in-depth and deliver the recommendations to the different presidents of parliament. In short, this idea was to show, well, even though the people in the north and the south vote very different, perhaps they can still come up with compromises that show which direction federal policies could go. This is a big picture. You can tell there's a lot of people being there. And let's talk about the results a bit. I would say that the short-term results, in all honesty, they were mitigated, I would say. The policy recommendations of these citizens, they were handed over to the presidents of parliament, but there was very little or no formal follow-up. Why? Because this was a bottom-up initiative, and politicians felt a bit, they didn't know really what to do with the recommendations. It was a very first big citizens assembly that was happening in Belgium. They were negotiating to form all sorts of governments at the same time, so it was a bit of a difficult context to create follow-up. However, what we did succeed with in the short term was an enormous enthusiasm. And this is one of the things that I would like to tell you as well. This sort of democratic innovation can create an enormous amount of energy among all different sorts of organizations and citizens who want to support this. More than 800 volunteers worked together with us at this event. This was a grassroots initiative. More than 3,000 people funded this. It was crowdsourced. There were 40 voluntary interpreters, different national observers, because everyone thought, well, this is an interesting experiment to see how democracy can look differently. Remember, this is 2011. This is very early days for Citizen Assembly history. So this was still a rather new thing, I would say, in the field of democracy. In the long term, however, I think we created something really unique. Followed by this very first experiment, several regional governments mostly, but also the federal governments decided, hey, this is something that we should do more structurally. The German-speaking region, the very small region in the East, created the very first permanent citizens dialogue in the world, always working with different sorts of randomly selected citizen panels around a range of different subjects. In Brussels, they have even two different types of permanent structured citizens assemblies. They have mixed commissions where politicians and citizens talk and work together about different sorts of topics. And they have a permanent citizens assembly on climate as well, because it is such a big and important issue that they have a dedicated permanent citizens assembly working on that. The regional government of Wallonia and the South also has mixed commissions and citizen panels, started a bit more recently. And at the federal level, they've done all sorts of legislative work to create a sortition bill to make this even more possible. And at the local level, there's been dozens of one-off citizens assemblies. So even though the policy impact of the first G1000 was very restricted, I think it's safe to say that this was a very important moment that changes democracy and the way that we talk about democracy in Belgium. We get sometimes some international press attention from this work as well, which is always nice, of course. But more importantly, democracy continues to evolve. There's talk now that the Senate in Belgium should be reformed to a people's chamber. So this very old institution gets a new functioning. In federal parliament, they're also still talking about ways to integrate citizens' assemblies in parliamentary work. And importantly, more and more civil society organizations are also interested in this. Environmental organizations, healthcare organizations, universities, more and more, they also want to experiment with this sort of new way of decision making. So a few takeaways that I will want to share with you before leaving the floor to the next speaker. Like Art said, the mandate is crucial. You need to be as clear as possible on what you ask from citizens and then deliver on what you promise. If you want that citizens, if you promise that the recommendations of citizens will be put together in a referendum that then will be followed by legislative work, that's great. You should do that. If the recommendations of citizens are only going to serve as a sort of advice that the parliament will then react on, that's also okay, but at least explain it right from the outset when you organize this thing. Picking the question is the most difficult part, so invest enough time in this, but Art already said a lot about this, so I'll continue. Interesting, I think, for Israel as well, is that multilingualism and multiculturalism is actually an asset. The research on G1000 showed that the quality of deliberation on bilingual tables, where there were interpreters working, was actually higher than at one language tables, because people had to listen more carefully to the interpretation that was coming afterwards, and they had to think a bit before they were reacting. So this is actually something that could be interesting within your context as well. And in the broader context, finally, the legitimacy with your broader process is crucial. Make sure that you select your citizens randomly through a sortition process. Make sure that you have an oversight board with different organizations and stakeholders present that oversee your process, and make sure that you are as transparent as possible on the mandate and what's happening with the recommendations afterwards. I'll leave you with three metaphors. Citizens' assemblies are like pancakes. The first one's always a bit tricky. So try to do a bit of expectation management on the first assembly and allow yourself a bit of room of maneuver to experiment. We would do a lot of things different than we did with the first G1000, but you still usually end up with very decent processes because there's a lot of knowledge that's present at this point already. Citizens Assemblies, secondly, are also an antidote for the democratic disease, the democratic fatigue that we are feeling, but also more personally, if you ever feel a bit cynical on where politics is and the possibilities of coming up with political decisions still, then organize a Citizens Assembly. I've been very closely involved in one very recently, and it's one of the most hopeful experiences for you, but also for citizens to take part in if you organize it correctly. And finally, Citizens Assemblies are also like a good workout. It makes you happy to participate in them, but it also trains citizens actually to become better citizens. The citizens that have participated in one big assembly that we organized recently, they ended more than a year ago. They're still following the process. They're still pushing politicians to do stuff with their recommendations. Some of them even go in politics because they feel this is actually quite interesting, what we've been doing. So in a way, this is an investment in citizens that also pays off in the longer term. If you want to learn more about this, we organize every year a two-day spring school in Eupen. One of the people from Democracy 3.0 participated in this as well. This is where you can learn to organize these things if you would be interested. If you are, feel free to reach out to me. If not, that's absolutely fine. It was fantastic speaking to you, and I'll give the floor now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Ben. It was more than 12 minutes, but it was worth it. Whenever people here in Israel hearing about Citizen Assembly are telling us that Israeli society or Israeli situation is too complex, we are unique, we can't do it, or something like that, I give the example for Belgium, for 1.5 years without a government. So, thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Damir Kapitzik from the US, currently. Damir is an associate professor at the University of Sarajevo and a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center. Advised deliberative processes and citizen assemblies in Southern Europe regions where post-conflict environments are crossed with religious diversity. He is currently writing a book on citizen assemblies in the context of post-conflict. He is a member of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group and consults on deliberative processes for the Council of Europe. Damir will discuss the case of citizen assemblies in the local authority of Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2021 that has the context of the post-ethnical conflict at Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 90s. So, Damir, please.
Thank you very much, Ronen. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Now, what I'm going to talk about with the assembly, went one too fast. What I'm going to talk about in the assembly, and now moving on from these, we started off in Northwestern Europe, and then we're moving slowly over the continent, and now we're in Southeastern Europe, so moving towards Israel, I guess. This is an assembly in an unconsolidated post-conflict context. This is sort of the thing that I want to put you with. And while Belgium still holds the world record for not having a government, Bosnia and Herzegovina is, I think, third. We didn't have a government for over 500 days, around the same time as Belgium didn't have theirs. The context is a post-conflict one, because Bosnia and Herzegovina experienced a three-year-long war between 1992 and 1995. And the assembly that I'm going to talk about was held in one of the cities that experienced some of the most vicious conflict. So the bridge that you see here on the next slide, you will see how it looked like during that conflict, and it was destroyed during it. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Bridge, and a lot of the atrocities that happened in the country still have a deep impact, and that still leaves a mark among the people. So just a bit of context before this, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a small-ish country, but it is ethnically and religiously hugely diverse. There are populations of Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and Catholics, and all of them also, onto this religious identity, have a linguistic and a national one on top of it. There is huge polarization within the country in terms of politics, and there's also this unease of living together. Now, Mostar is in itself a diverse city. It's not a big city. It's around 100,000 people there, but it is roughly divided between Muslim Bosniaks and Catholic Croats. Now, in the city itself, the bridge was shelled during the conflict. It was destroyed, and there are huge dividing lines in the city that are still very much present. Other cities experienced equal amounts of conflict. Sarajevo experienced siege. Various parts of the country experienced ethnic cleansing. There was a genocide in Srebrenica. This is something that still shapes the country even 30 years after conflict ended. So these experiences, what we say lived experiences of the people, are very much raw and present when you talk to them. And the essence of deliberative democracy is bringing people together to talk. And they bring these experiences with them. Now, moving into this and trying to organize a citizens' assembly in a place like Mostar, where people have had these experiences, was not easy, to put it at least. The context of Mostar is also very specific. In itself, the city didn't have a government for 8 years because they could not agree on electoral reform. 12 years, no elections were held in the city. And when moving forward with this idea to try to bring citizens together, the Council of Europe, this is the body that had the idea to bring citizens together, essentially tried to bring a topic forward that was acceptable to everyone. Now, there was no city government who could propose a topic. So we opened it up to citizens to select one. On trying to bring some reforms to the city itself. And this was done through an online poll at the very beginning, where everyone could propose a topic, and over 1,800 people proposed different topics to discuss. Now, they were grouped, and the top 20 were given to civil society to try to debate on which would be most applicable to the country and to the city, sorry. Out of those, they selected 6 for them given to this city council, which had elections in the meantime, finally, and was formed. They selected 3, and this was given back to citizens to decide during this registration process for the first Citizens Assembly in Mostar. By the way, this first Citizens Assembly in Mostar was also the first in the country and the first in Southeast Europe as well. It was our first pancake, to put it that way. Now, this open process resulted in a question where citizens wanted to discuss the issue of city cleanliness and public spaces. It's not a conflictual issue, which helped very much in bringing these people together to discuss something in such a context. When selecting the people for our Citizens Assembly, and this is the picture of the group that we ended up with, we had to take into account a lot of different factors. So apart from age and gender, the most 2 basic ones, one key ingredient was this ethnic diversity. So we have in this group represented both Catholics and Muslims, Croats, Bosniaks, Serbs, atheists, others. This identity aspect was hugely important. And you cannot tell from the picture itself who is who, even though when they are in the room together, they're pretty much aware of this. Issues such as education, such as city residence, and also employment status were also included in this. Now, when we bring people together to discuss in this way, there are some very key aspects that we needed to take into account. And for example, one of the most vocal participants of the Citizens Assembly, he was at the very beginning hugely skeptical that this would work. He's standing right in the middle. I won't point him out right now. He was hugely skeptical that they would even be able to agree on policies, on outcomes, on recommendations, and that politics would listen to them. And among the group itself, you could see a very reserved skepticism at the beginning of the assembly itself. Now, how was this assembly selected? And how did it work? Well, the civic lottery was held where we sent out 5 6,000 letters, and amongst this, we selected 48 random members according to these criteria, which I just mentioned. The topic and remit selection, this was done separately through this open process. The assembly itself came together for 3 weekends, a total of 6 days. It's not a hugely long assembly. It's not a very large assembly, but this idea that you can actually try to create and to do and run an assembly in such a context, this was something that was not tried to this extent before. In the first weekend, it was an introduction and a learning stage where all the participants basically opened up. And I like to say that it was more like a therapy session among them. They sometimes didn't even cross into the other parts of the city where other groups lived. They were aware of their own problems, but now they were listening that others just living a few hundred or half a kilometer away had the same problems as they did. They were looking basically for the same solutions, and they just needed to work together to make them happen. And this learning stage, when learning about the problem, was also learning about each other as a community in a way. Now, the next step was learning from experts and learning from other best experiences and trying to discuss how to solve the issues that they had. Now, Mostar had a huge problem with waste and trash collection, where you could think of it as a almost Lebanese scenario where there is uncollected trash collecting across the city, just simply because politics could not agree on how to solve that issue. There are 2 trash collection companies, 2 companies that take care of public spaces, and they were not working together. Through deliberation, citizens were able to draft outcomes, and they came up with 32 recommendations. These were presented to politics, they received feedback on them, and finalized their 32 recommendations in 5 separate thematic areas. They voted on this, and all 32 passed among the citizens who voted, the members of the assembly who voted on them. Now, where this becomes a little what we call a success story is when these recommendations were presented to the city council a few months later. And the city council, they looked at all of them and basically decided to adopt everything that the citizens proposed. All 32 recommendations were passed, and they created an action plan on how to address them. This city council thought that we actually want to listen to the citizens because this is something that might be a good solution. Now, out of the 32, a third have been implemented, a third are ongoing, and another third are either on hold or there have been some other issues that complicate those implementations. But what I'm trying to say here is that politics listened to the citizens in a way that hasn't happened in such a country as Bosnia, especially in a city such as Mostar, where government was basically not there for a very long time in a legitimate way. Now, this is various forms of how citizens do engage. There is this idea that they learn, and this learning is mostly done in a huge group, in a plenary session where they listen to experts, where they ask questions individually. It's like trying to bring things to citizens and to get them become experts in the topic. The politicians that usually make decisions in parliament learn the same way. They don't know about the topic in advance. They take time to learn about it, and citizens do the same. But what differentiates this a lot from parliament is that citizens then, after this learning, come together in smaller groups, which are again randomly brought together. There's no sort of self-grouping, but we are in the design of the process being aware of this and randomly put them in groups, and these groups change. And here they can listen to others' views on how they think that the topic should be addressed, on how their experience informs them that certain recommendations might work better than others. From these small group discussions, we move the citizens back into the plenary. And throughout the process, they get to learn both about the topic, they get to learn about their community and about the experience of others. And this builds them into something that is more of a cohesive group. Now, as an outcome, you could see that the citizens themselves became much more aware both of the diversity of opinions in the room, but also of the experience of others. So just as an example, and I'll conclude with this, when we were presenting these small group discussions at one point, and 3 have already been presented, the 4th group was starting to present, but they said, we'll change the person presenting because we already had 3 people from the Croat group presenting. Now, to give a little bit more diversity and to be seen as equal, we're going to change this and let a Bosniak woman, a Muslim woman, present instead. So this self-awareness, it comes with citizens working as a group, working together. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damir. I'm afraid that here in Israel, we're going to need your expertise later on. Thank you very much. So, our last speaker is Dr. Caroline Lukensmeer. Caroline has led the field of deliberative democracy in the US for over 3 decades. In her extensive career, Caroline has held several leadership positions, including being the founding executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, founder and president of America Speaks, that actually did what Caroline is going to talk about in a minute. She also served as chief of staff of Governor Celeste in Ohio and was a consultant to the office of chief of staff for the Clinton-Gore administration. So Caroline will discuss the case of Citizen Congress in New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina in 2005. May I say that I visited America Speaks exactly earlier this year to see another amazing event that we were doing in a different scale of thousands of citizens. So please, Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ronan. I am honored and delighted to be with you all today. I want to start by underlining a point that each of the previous speakers made that I think is so essential to the importance of this work. Art said that the hunger across the world for citizens to have a seat at the table in terms of the policies and quality of their life. It is true. The time has come to evolve our democratic governance structures. What Ben said, what do we all need to do when we need hope in terms of some of the dismal political situations that are happening around the world, is participate in one of these and see what can happen as citizens truly learn to listen, change their perspective, and come to agreements about common good. And last, Damir, your reference to the fact the deepness of the issues because of the war. Right now in the United States of America, our politics are demonstrating how the Civil War, which happened in the 1860s, still is deeply enmeshed in the determination of our political conflicts, which cannot be resolved. After the flooding and Hurricane Katrina, there are a couple of other realities about New Orleans that I would like you to understand. One is that it had a broken governance structure. People were not listened to in a meaningful way for many decades before this tragedy. And thus, problems were mainly about, excuse me, racial, deep mistrust and socioeconomic inequality. After the event happened, you may or may not know that literally hundreds of thousands of people who lived in New Orleans were basically in diaspora. Many people went to the airport, got on an airplane, had no idea, walked off the airplane in Denver or walked off the airplane in Minneapolis. So when America Speaks was called in, which we were called in after 3 failed public processes, so this crisis had just deepened and deepened, we knew that we had to bring together the representation of the city, not just of people who were still in New Orleans, but people who were in diaspora. So in total, We had 3,400 citizens, almost exactly demographically representative of the population of New Orleans pre-Katrina and the flooding. They were located in 5 cities: New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta. The critical factor that I would like to bring to the table that hasn't yet been talked much about is the importance of doing a systemic analysis of the context prior to designing the citizen engagement project. I've asked the organizers to, after the fact, share with you a matrix that we built about what has to be involved in this systemic analysis. Most important, it has to have on the horizontal line time, the past, the present, and the future. And then the factors are ones you would know: whose leadership, the demographics, the institutional landscape. But again, given our time, I won't do more detail about it, but I know that Ronan and Debbie will share that matrix with you later. By the time we did our work, the mayor had called one community congress that failed because there were almost no Black people there, and New Orleans was a majority African-American city. The second effort was done by a group of planning communities. It had somewhat better representation, but it only looked at neighborhoods. It did not look citywide. So we knew we had to do both citywide and neighborhood issues to have this have meaning, as well as having everyone in the room. At this stage, what broke this through, that made it possible for us to do what we did, was a very well-known businessman who was also a real confidant of President George W. Bush, named David Volker, who since has passed, literally went to President Bush and said, the Congress has already allocated $43 billion for the rebuilding of New Orleans, but your administration is not releasing it. Just tell me, what do you have to have so that we actually can do this work and have access to those already allocated funds? What President Bush said was that there had to be a unified voice from the governor, the state legislature, the mayor, the city council, and the recovery body that had already been set up in the state. Those 5 entities had to agree on the priorities for rebuilding. That became the essence of what America Speaks designed in the second and third community congresses. Because even after this was understood, one more Congress was held that did not have, done locally, that did not have the adequate representation in it. When we convened 3,400 people sitting in 5 cities to look at those issues, you could palpably feel the sense of people understanding that all of New Orleans was in the room. Very dramatic things happened. A family in Atlanta saw a person in New Orleans, they didn't even know each other was still alive, which was the level of crisis that the city was still in. We were able, because of the way we had brought all the stakeholders, both the formal ones with power, the informal ones that were highly effective but had no power, all of them influenced the actual material that we put together to put in front of that public to actually talk at tables of 10 with computers, with voting keypads to determine the priorities for the city of New Orleans. There never would be enough money to completely rebuild in even a 10 to 15-year time frame. Everyone knew that sacrifice would have to be made. In the end, the citizens did actually develop the series of priorities that they felt were the most important. And those were taken to the mayor and city council, those were taken to the governor and state legislature, and those were taken to the recovery council that had been created. And what President Bush told David actually was accomplished. It was a moment in which it gives me chills to tell you this now, which is since 2006. Everyone was absolutely inspired that we can do this, and everyone was very shaky. Given the lack of appropriate governance structures, would this hold? Would this be respected? So America Speaks understood, yes, our citizen engagement piece was done, but because we were a trusted, neutral entity, we would have to stay engaged in the process to ensure that a new governance structure that involved both the formal power structure and the informal voices that never held any power in New Orleans would be an oversight body to ensure the implementation of the choices that were made by the public. It wasn't all smooth. There were many fits and starts, but there was enough focus on the commitments made by this representative sample of the population and by the media playing an appropriate role of tracking the implementation process and crying foul when any one of the entities stepped outside the lines. There was a very dramatic moment when the Planning Commission of New Orleans, which was dominantly a white body, who had seen this as the opportunity to redesign New Orleans in a way that would help the majority population. It took data that was developed by citizens and some of my staff to bring that to public life, to upend that attempt to break the consensus on the priorities in New Orleans. I'm thrilled to say that we actually did accomplish. The money followed the priorities that the citizens set. And it's also true, and it's part of why you've got to study the history of the issues in the context. 10 years later, yes, a lot of residents' homes had been rebuilt. They were done as they should have been done pretty equally across neighborhoods, but fundamental issues in the city, inequality of income, racial disparities, had not moved a single percentage. So it was incumbent upon both the public and the existing people in power to commit to dealing with the ongoing issues that existed in New Orleans prior to the hurricane and the flooding. I'm going to stop there. I think my time is not quite up. I just want to acknowledge that for me to be part of this is quite a gift. It's quite something to have seen the United States be a real innovator and experimenter in these methods in the 90s, in the early 2000s. And yet we failed in this country to make the connection so that it would become institutionalized, as it has in Ireland, as it has in Belgium. And we know that what is happening now in the citizens' assemblies that you are all connected to is an opportunity to bring this work back into our country. I know that on this webinar, Marshani Sassi is with us. She is playing a significant connecting role to bring the expertise, keeping it culturally sensitive in the US, but to try to establish enough footholds that maybe we can achieve what always was the vision for deliberative democracy in the US, to establish an institutionalized basis at the federal, state, and local level where citizens' voices are is in our Constitution, that we have the capability, we the people, of self-governing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Caroline. This was fascinating and intense. I mean, the whole presentations. While I was familiar with most of the stories, I gained new insights. So thank you so much. Actually, we don't have time for 2 rounds of questions as we thought. I do have a similar question for one round with all our speakers, but I would like to note some of the things that we picked from the chat. Many questions and remarks were about actually answers can be found in various websites and documents, including on our own Democracy 3.0, but other links that are in the chat that I think we shall perhaps send all of them to all participants after this session. Some of the questions, I would like just to note a few questions without answering them. One question was about is there a limit to the complexity of an issue? For example, is a constitution, forming a constitution is a good one for Citizen Assembly. Repeated questions. What made politicians to give up their power to do that in the cases that they had to do that? How do you guarantee that a citizen assembly is not abused by other powers? Or how do you let citizens set the agenda of a citizen assembly? And some other important questions. So I would like to ask our speakers about our own situation. Israel is facing a complex crisis on multiple levels. Domestically, there is a debate over the structure of our democracy, particularly concerning the independence of the judiciary authority, bringing a massive protest after that. Internationally, the conflict with Hamas, designated as a terrorist organization by many countries, presents another challenge, including victims and evacuees. So I'm asking all of you, can you offer advice or tips for those seeking to promote a similar process to address these crises effectively? Unfortunately, I can give 1.5 minutes to each speaker, if that's okay. Why don't we do it in another set of speakers and start with Caroline?
Thank you, Renan. I clearly humbly want to say I don't know the details of this, but it seems to me the place that citizens' assemblies could be extraordinarily important in Israel going forward is in the committee that Shahar is leading that spoke to us at the beginning of this conversation, in that the issue about whether or what will happen in Israel relative to Jews and Palestinians, I think immediately will be more easily dealt with at the local level. And by using deliberative democracy processes in many communities strategically chosen by geography and demographics, could actually begin to build up a sense of options for what could happen in the future that would be unlikely to come from any of the highly invested institutional architecture of both the Palestinian part of Israel and the Jewish part of Israel that has gone on since 1948. I hope that might be helpful.
Thank you, Caroline. Please, Dario, the same question.
So one citizen assembly I did not talk about that I also organized in Bosnia was a national one on electoral reform in a context where, again, there was conflict and groups could not agree. I did not mention it because while the assembly was very well structured and the outcomes were outside of the box, they were something that was not part of political dialogue, there was no uptake by politics of those recommendations. They could not agree on even listening to the citizens on what they wanted to say. Having them at the local level, especially in these kind of divisive contexts, is much, much easier. There's no pan-Belgium assembly yet, even though Belgium is a front runner of democratic innovations. Starting off from a more local level is something that really brings these processes into the public sphere and makes them more recognized as a way to solve the complex issues. Now, there is one take on this, and that is violence. As long as there is a threat against the physical security of participants, citizens' assemblies won't be able to work. So there are limits even to this. Complex topics can be addressed. I don't see an issue there in terms of how complex it can get. But the issue of security of participants, that's key. Start off local and then try to build on from there.
Thank you, Damir. Ben, the same question. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. I completely agree with what Damir and Caroline have just mentioned. I think it's very wise counsel. Often these things need a bit of a proof of concept that shows the legitimacy, the validity, and the quality that these assemblies can bring. And they're often, I think, the local level is a good place to experiment with these things. I would hope, however, that in a later phase, also on a national level, I think theoretically speaking and ideologically speaking, I think it could be a huge asset, I think, for Israeli politics. And I say this in all honesty and in all humbleness, for sure not grasping the complexity of the situation in its entirety, but this can bring people together from very different communities. What Damir has also seen in Mostar, I think I completely agree with him. Once some level of conflict has rescinded, there are ways to bring these communities together and to still come up with consensus and compromises together. Maybe one thing about the agenda setting, and then I'll stop. Let experienced citizens who have done such an experience participate in the agenda setting for the following part. They have had the experiments, they know what's possible and what's not possible, so they're a very good group to do this.
Thank you, Ben. And Art, please.
Thank you, Ronan, and I agree with all my colleagues here as well. I mean, this is wise advice. The one thing we have discovered here in Ireland is that political leadership here is important, you know, and it's not going to work unless and until the politicians have a role in asking the question. Here's a problem that we need to be solved. And then they make a commitment in relation to what they're going to do when the results come back or the recommendations come back as well. And I mean, I've spoken about this many times in many countries as well, is that politicians all over the world, they need, as Ben said, proof of concept. And we can be a little impatient, you know, waiting for bottom-up development, you know, local assemblies working in municipalities, etc., etc. It takes a long time. What you are looking for here is transformational change. And there are many, many examples all over the world, as we have heard, of people who've been involved in transformational change. You need to encourage Israeli politicians to come and see what is possible. Go and spend some time in a room with some people who can show them, I mean, how this works, and they can listen to the story. Because until the political system believes that this kind of change is possible, then nothing will ever change, because it's too much of a risk for them to give away, as some of the questions appeared in the chat, this power, this perception of giving away of power.
Thank you, Art. Thank you all. Okay, I would like to invite Professor Calypso Nicolaidis from Italy to give her concluding remarks. May I say that we've met Calypso only in October, meaning about 3 months ago, but we feel in our team that she is that our friendships has started as a deep friendship, and this is why we are having here in our webinar. Professor Calypso Nicolaidis holds the chair of Global Affairs at the EUI School of Transnational Governance in Florence, leading the Democracy Forum. She is currently on leave from Oxford University, where she's been professor in international relations since 1999. She previously taught at Harvard Kennedy School of Governments and ENA. She has also collaborated with many EU institutions and was a member of the European Council, a reflections group on Europe's future. Her research covers European integration, global affairs, and international relations. One of Calypso's latest projects that we hope to be part of, that she's involves co-leading the Democratic Odyssey project, launched in September last year, with the aim to create a permanent European Citizens Assembly. So, please, Calypso, please.
Thank you so much, Ronan, for having me. And I must say, I'm sure that all the participants in this Zoom share my sense with me that in so little time we have covered so much geography, so many contexts, and they seem somehow at a distance with Israel today. And yet everybody in their mind is weaving various threads, more or less thin, more or less relevant. And that is so important because the topic that you, Ronan, and the team, and Debbie and all others are so committed to is really this question that we've discussed. Is it possible for so-called ordinary citizens, whatever that means, to come together and talk from completely different backgrounds and do so peacefully? And of course, the question seems almost surreal right now in Israel, and yet it's an indispensable question. It's an indispensable question. And I guess the conversation today is about seeds, planting seeds of hope. Planting seeds of hope, but with eyes wide open, is my sense. And this is what we've discussed. Eyes wide open because, you know, Art just said it now, you know, and there were questions, as you said, Ronan, about power. You know, why would politicians give up power? This is a real question in Israel. And, you know, Art, but also Ben said from their circumstances, well, you know, don't worry, politicians, you know, this is not about replacing your government, your parliaments. Yeah, we can answer in that way, and this is in great part true from the experience, but I think we can also walk away thinking, you know, this is maybe more, the story we're telling is maybe more difficult than that. They do feel threatened, and if citizens really do take power, it is threatening for some of those up there in power. So yes, we hope it can be reconcilable, but this is the story we're talking about, Citizens Assembly. It's also a struggle by citizens. Then we have other questions just now that you asked about, you know, the local versus the national. Indeed, as you say, I'm leading a transnational project for a transnational European Assembly. But we ourselves say, you know, this has to happen within an ecosystem all over Europe of local Citizens Assembly, local participatory democracy. And indeed, you've all taken part in organizing Kiryat Yon, which was about a seemingly technical issue, waste reduction. So there is some experience. There was a comment in the chat about Jerusalem. Michal, I think, yes, there has been some small experiences in Israel, but I think the story that we heard is that start local, yes, because the key is to build a culture so that people on radio or TV, they hear Citizen Assembly, they understand that it's randomly selected. They understand that this is about creating a space and a group of people who represent the town, the city, the country. But this will take time. And so I think part of the story that we're hearing is you start local. Yes, okay, we can say that. But on the other hand, is there time? Is there time? There is a sense, whether it's in Israel, but also elsewhere, that, you know, at the national level, we need to do things. So how much time and how do you build from the local to the national? That's a really big question that we will need to think about all together. And then how are all the different conflicts? A third question that I think was very clear from the discussion. How are all these different types of conflicts, cleavages, connected? Because yes, we heard from Art, you know, that some are very key constitutional questions. Maybe that's about values. And this is when I entered the conversation in Israel last March, when we were talking about possibly a citizen assembly addressing the deep judicial conflict of this society. And we heard from Art that when you talk abortion or gay marriage in Ireland, this is also about deep value/constitutional question, or Bosnia, the governance, these constitutional, but under these, we have socioeconomic. Caroline spoke about this, and in Ireland too, and in Israel, it is so clear that underlying constitutional conflict is socioeconomic. And of course, the deepest of all is interethnic and wars. You know, we say post-conflict, but is that a euphemism? We're talking about post-wars. How do you go from a war to a post-war to reconciliation to assembly? That journey is such a long, arduous journey, and some of us might think, well, an impossible one, but is it? You know, it depends how we can deal with the intensity of conflict. We hear about citizen assembly on technical issues. Yes, there's always politics, there's always conflict, but when we are in highly adversarial conflict, how do people start the conversation? And that's part of the challenge, indeed. And is it a moment of crisis, or is it an intractable, long, hard, difficult, impossible conversation? And then also, of course, underlying this is the question of representation. You've heard everyone say we took a group of representative citizens, but what's the criteria? How inclusive? What's the boundary? Who is the us within which we choose? Whether it's a town, a nation, a region, what is the boundary? And the criteria, you know, is it going to be tall and short people?
Calypso, we would like
So,
to
you know,
wrap up.
Yes, I'm wrapping up just to say that, you know, we heard from Tamara, Ben, Maya, this whole question of facilitation. What does it even mean to be neutral? Is that even possible in highly intensive conflict, mandate, expectation? So what I'm trying to say in conclusion, Ronan, is I think what we all hear and believe is that Citizens Assembly are very much a seed of hope for how we can move beyond conflict, but at the same time full of really hard challenges. There is no magic wand here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Calypso. So on behalf of myself, my colleagues at Democracy 3.0 and everyone else, I would like to thank our speakers who are truly amongst the most skilled and influential in the field of deliberative democracy. So for the last sentence, I'm going to switch back to Hebrew. לפני שאנחנו נפרדים, אני רוצה לאפשר לדקה וחצי למנהלת המעבדה לאספות אזרחים בדמוקרטיה 3.0, דניאלה זגמן, לספר לנו על הפרויקט הכי חדש ועדכני שלנו. לא לדאוג, זה ייקח ממש קצר ונסיים גם בזמן.
אני אגיד ממש בקצרה, קודם כל תודה לצוות מדהים של המעבדה ודמוקרטיה 3.0 על הארגון של הוובינר הזה שהיה מעניין ומלמד, וכמו שהדוברים ממש הרימו לנו להנחתה, במעבדה אנחנו שואפים באמת להתחיל ולהוכיח ניסיון של אספות אזרחים ברמה המקומית עם רשויות מקומיות, ואני לא אהיה פחות פרקטית מזה שאני אגיד שממש בעוד חודש מהיום, חודש ושבוע, אנחנו נפרסם קול קורא שמזמין רשויות מקומיות להיכנס איתנו לתהליך של למידה וביצוע של אספות אזרחים ברשויות מקומיות. אז אני קוראת לכם to stay tuned, ואני אגיד שאפשר למצוא מידע על כל מה שדיברו פה היום והלאה קדימה באתר של דמוקרטיה 3.0, ואפשר למצוא אותנו שם, ואנחנו מחכים לכם, ואני מחזירה את הבמה אליך לפרידה, רונן.
טוב, אז תודה רבה לכולם. דניאלה הפנתה אתכם לאתר שלנו, so thank you very much. And we end this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you. תודה רונן.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
yeah.
very, very much. This was just a privilege. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
תודה רבה, נותן תקווה.